Hello, everybody. Today I'm with a very good friend of mine. I know I start these saying that, oh, I'm talking with a really good friend of mine, but this guy really is a good friend of mine. This is Carlos Casados, and Carlos is an expert, in my opinion, in the fields of hypnotherapy, neurolinguistic programming, personal development. He trains and coaches people in such areas as public speaking, and he does all kinds of unique activities. And he's one of the top hypnotherapy trainers and coaches on the West Coast. So, Carlos, thanks for talking with me today.
Thank you so much, Paul. When you asked me to be on here, I felt very honored, and I love having conversations with you. I
Oh,
love going into
excellent.
it.
Thank you. Well, same here. Thank you. Well, I just want to start by asking what kind of brought you to the field you're in. Just from knowing you, you're very eclectic and you're interested in so many different things. So what
Yeah.
kind of brought you into the realm of I'll just call healing, at least emotional, mental healing? Because and I'll say to listeners and viewers, Carlos was featured in the documentary film called Enlightenment about emotional and mental and physical healing. So what kind of brought you to that route?
I love the question because it's so broad. That's how I think of it.
Mhm.
One of the things that attracted me to you and the work you do is the fact that you have broadened, what we are talking about into the word healing. I love that. Um, I think I've had a focus on searching truth and healing myself since I was very, very little. Raised in probably what most people would call like traumatic upbringing, and that causes, I think, most everyone to try to figure out how to alleviate the pain. So for me, searching that out meant spirituality. It meant prayer. It meant meditation. It eventually meant yoga and kung fu, martial arts, that kind of thing. And those things have philosophies attached to them. And I think I maybe have some latent attraction to philosophy generally. So hearing about those things caused me to go a little deeper and a little deeper, and I just couldn't get enough of it. When I was a little kid, I would get to a library and I'd always be in the esoteric section, reading about alchemy and magic and witchcraft and Chinese martial arts and just anything that would take me further. As I got into high school, that kind of worked out to be an interest in abnormal psychology. So I would read about that and human sexuality, reading classics like the Masters and Johnson and things like that. And it just became a thing where I was searching for common threads. And those common threads led me into interesting avenues that unlocked doors for me and people who were influential. So it's been a really gradual kind of a gradual shifting or phasing into various kinds of healing. And that eventually took me down the road of Ayurvedic medicine. I studied at the California College of Ayurveda, and that gets into psychology, as well as the relationship of emotions to physical health and digestion and lifestyle changes, which is, again, coaching. Eventually kind of ended up down the road of hypnosis and NLP and other things like that. And I have to say that a big part of my own personal journey was the journey into sacred medicine. So it's kind of a popular thing these days to talk about that. But for me personally, that was a huge integrative piece for me. It's been over 3 decades, maybe 34 years of using plant medicines for, insight and meditation. And I think the journey continues. I'm still on it.
And I'm guessing this will be a lifetime journey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Based on
I want to point out too, not to interrupt, but I want to point out to people, I forgot to mention that you and our mutual friend Satch Purcell have an excellent podcast called The Authenticity Show that brings in all these different, areas of interest that you have. And I just want to acknowledge that that's a very inspiring podcast that you do that I believe obviously is part of your journey
It is.
as you go and sharing that. So,
Thank you. Thanks for
yeah.
mentioning that.
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'm going to jump back a little bit because you gave me a lot of good stuff there. What kind of really grabs you about this whole idea of human performance and psychology and all of that as you were going through your stages, and where do you see that, or at least from where you are now, how do you kind of view those perspectives?
For me, the word integration popped up when you were saying that. It's about piecing things together and finding a common yoke, a place to gather it together. I mean, that is the root of the word yoga, as you know. To create yoking or union between things, and between you and whatever you might think of as what connects everything together. Some people might call that God, or connectedness, or a greater picture, or something. So I see psychology and categories of things that fit into psychology, like NLP and things like that, as a way of creating commonality, integration, a vessel for delivery sometimes, to clients or to loved ones. It improves the communication. So, getting things across to others is important. It's one thing to have a spiritual awakening or some kind of realization, but it's another thing to integrate that into your life, or to be able to communicate it to others. So for me, that was very much a part of it. And also there's this trait, I think, where sometimes people who push to have mystical experiences don't do the integration part, and then they have a hard time with it. So I just feel like that's an important aspect, that if you don't handle that, or if you don't handle it, if you don't work on it, if you don't develop it, you don't create enough of a vessel to hold all of that wisdom or truth that you might gain along the way.
Mhm. When somebody comes to you, and everyone's unique, I mean, we both agree on that, but someone
Mm.
comes to you and says, my life isn't going well, whether it's due to what's happened to me in the past, what's happening to me now, the decisions or choices I make. And I realize this is very broad. What's your first kind of view of this person as an individual, and what kind of routes in your mind do you feel like is good to kind of explore with them?
Yeah. So when a person comes to me, the first thing I think of is, I guess you might call it like respect or compassion. That's the space that I try to go into first, which is, I don't really know this person. What I do know is that they're coming to me, and they may have a bunch of presuppositions about who I am and what I can do for them, or what I can't do for them, all sorts of things. And so my first intention is to feel into it with my heart, but to also stay very alert with my head, as far as listening carefully for structure, because I want to be able to not throw myself at the problem. I'd rather kind of lovingly create a space where the problem emerges, and I can see a pattern in it that I can help them with, or I can invite them into exploring it. So that's kind of my general approach. Lately, I've had the sense that it's just completely okay not to know, and to be leaning on the edge of my seat with the expectation that something might emerge from it that could be really cool. And so I'm more alert to that lately, over the last couple of years, especially. And I realized that the safe container for all of that is just a general agape feeling. The feeling of, I care about you, I want what's best for you, whatever that is.
Mhm. Why do you think other therapists, coaches, people like that seem to have the most trouble with that? That, I care about you. You think, and particularly in my field, we're all trained on empathy, but then we find the research that that's what therapists struggle with often the
Yeah.
most. Why do you, from your perspective, why do you think sometimes people struggle with that?
Well, I see that people feel like burnout, I guess you could say. They get so into the idea that they have to care, and then they feel burned by it, and then they learn this counter, or let's say a reaction to that feeling is, well, I can't let that happen again, and then they close off, instead of learning how to refine it, or learning how to take it up an octave into a higher level, like an overdrive kind of thing. They just, I think they're limited by the preconceptions they have around empathy. One of my teachers, Michael Watson, said, empathy is overrated. And it got a chuckle out of the crowd because it was a bunch of people who were really, compassionate souls,
Mm.
And in context, I understood what it meant, at least for me, that we sometimes place too much emphasis on that rather than asking ourselves, how can we really be of service to the person, truly of service? And can we understand that love doesn't have to be an attachment kind of love? Like there's a kind of love that feels just goodwill towards someone
Mhm.
and feels understanding,
Mhm.
meaning, we look at all the ways in which they are and all the choices they've made, and there are probably reasons that make sense to them, even if from the outside we could see a better way. Even if they could see a better way looking backwards, it's still a set of reasons that they had for it, and it's not that hard if we just look at it that way. So people, I think, who get burnt out by that start to close off, and I think they start to just sort of technique their way through things instead of just creating or co-creating with people.
Mhm. Yeah, it's like we used to hear a lot in therapy training about the compassion to confront.
Oh,
And sometimes, like you say, empathy, we have a very limited perspective. Because I know I've just in my life, there have been people who've called me on my BS, but I didn't like it. But yet I knew underneath that there's some compassion there because they really wanted me to be better rather than just being a jerk and pointing out the multiple flaws that I have. So I think that's an intriguing way to think about empathy. Is like you said that it doesn't have to just be one thing. It can be empathy more of in everything rather than okay, now I'm going to do empathy now. Now I'm empathic, but okay, let me turn the empathy off. I think that's a very wise way to look at it. As you were saying that, something popped in my head, and I
Mhm.
remember there was a book. I never read it, but I remember the title by Wayne Dyer called "Every Problem Has a Spiritual Solution" or something like that.
Mhm.
That popped in my head. I just want to throw it out there. Talk about that. Does that resonate with you?
Resonates a lot. I've never read the book, but I'm fond of saying problems are solutions.
Yes. Yeah.
I didn't make that up.
Yeah.
It's something I've heard in a variety of ways.
Hmm.
Even you have stated it in different words
Hmm.
in the book that I read recently that you gave me. I love that book, by the way.
No,
The
thank you.
um, the title slipping.
Transforming
Themes,
things.
transforming themes. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Thank you.
Awesome way that you structured that and delivered that. But the problem is the solution if you think about it, because on the first layer of a problem is, of course, people's reaction, their visceral reaction. I don't like that, or I don't want it to be, and they can say, well, the problem isn't a solution. If you say, well, what's the solution? How is it a solution? It isn't. It's causing me pain or it's causing me difficulty.
Hmm.
But if they sit with it, if I insist with them to look a little deeper beyond that, I'll say, well, what is it satisfying? What part of you is it satisfying? What is it creating? Just get out of the way of it for a second and take a look at the impression it makes in the mold, in the wax. What's the shape of this thing that it's created? What's the shape of the problem? And the whole idea of associating into the problem so that you can get boundary conditions, like ways in which you perceive the problem as a problem. It tells you a lot about the way you're constructing it, the narratives inside, and the presuppositions and assumptions that are there. And unless you do that, it's like you're kind of never really feeling the problem totally. And there's that old expression of feel it to heal it. I think that can be true, because without feeling it, you don't really know how specifically these things are creating problems. So I see the problem being a solution in a variety of ways. And if you expand out into a family system, view on it, I'm really, really, really interested in family constellations and systemic work. And the more I run into, um, let's say, challenges people are having that are repetitive, the more I'm seeing it, how it relates to these things that happened before they were even born sometimes. the dynamics that feed in transgenerationally. So if I ask that question, how is the problem a solution, my own intuition begins to kick in. I start to shift into a different state where I'm looking at this from a very, very large perspective, and it kind of inductively draws the other person into that.
Mm-hmm.
And together, we end up making little realizations, like they started to have a flash of something, or I'll get a flash of something and ask a question about it.
Mm-hmm.
And sooner or later, this problem starts to speak, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
It acts like it's a part of the system that wants to be heard for some reason.
Right.
And as I go a little further with that, the problem ceases to be a problem, but more of a wake-up call or a call for help, or something. And so already that theme begins to transform from problem into invitation, or into a red flag, or some kind of an alert system.
Mm-hmm.
Then I can take an even further step and ask myself, how is it even possible that that could be? What would it take in order to create a scenario where the system is, begging for your energy and your attention so much that it's creating these symptoms? So I can trace it all the way back from, I don't know why I have this anger problem, it sucks. I'm, all the way back to something that goes beyond them. And then there's less antagonism in that moment. They start to look at it as maybe an invitation to love, an invitation to reconnect, an invitation to resolve something that had been unresolved all their life. So I just think problems are solutions these days, and
Mm-hmm.
it serves me well to think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. What the spiritual nature of that is, just, I would think, just having to go inside and really sitting with the labeled problem into metaphoric or even literal dialogue with it, because that's the spiritual part, is that we are getting to know ourselves. But I guess it's natural human nature, we move away from pain, move toward pleasure, kind of behaviorist, that we don't give it oftentimes the attention that it needs, and or welcoming it in, because, well, no, that I don't like that, that's scary, that's hurtful, that's, all these maybe somatic symptoms, but not that more uh, greater context, if you will,
Yeah.
of the problem. Do you get, when you're working with people and you're going this route, do you find that you have to work harder to get them to allow it, or do they feel comfortable with you a lot of times to just bring it forth?
For some people, the idea itself is really alien.
Mm-hmm.
It's outside their paradigm. So it might take a little bit of time to kind of find examples and analogies, but I don't find it any harder than any of the other things that I've done. I've just found that it's more inclusive and more in depth. But it's about, at least from my experience, it's been about equally easy and difficult, no matter what method we go about, as far as exploring solutions. I remember when I wasn't really working with a family model so much, that systemic model, and more just from a traditional NLP standpoint, and all those ideas. Well, not all of them. Some of them were very hard for people, very, very hard, and it took a while, to build whatever it was necessary to have them hold these, maybe experiment with a new model or something like that. That it was just as hard then as it has been now. But I find that my experience has taught me more and more ways to connect it to people, and to give them an excuse, if you will, to try on a new idea.
And I think that's also scary too, just the whole aspect of to try on something new.
Yeah.
We naturally aren't that comfortable with what's new. When you're working with people and they're saying, okay, we're going to welcome these parts in, when you get on the, and this is metaphorically, when you get on the other side of the problem, do, do you and your client kind of experience, not all the time, but this kind of, for lack of a better term, lightness they haven't been able to get to because they've been on one side? It's only when they kind of get to the other side of the problem, even though the problem's still there, it, and then it just changes the whole context of your work.
Yes. In particular, because I incorporate a lot of somatic questioning and somatic uh, looking and feeling into.
Mhm.
And then we work with postural changes and breath to break up what I would call patterns in the somatic
Mhm.
consciousness, because when taking them into a new point of view or a new realization or discovery, if I notice that there's a pattern in their body and I change it while I'm getting them to explore this new pattern, it takes them into new territory neurologically. I feel like they're just sort of in that blank space again. And when they do that and they kind of get to that point where they've followed the instructions and they've explored it, what they report back and what they show is the signs of being um, in a very different kind of a trance than they were in. The trance they had before was a very disempowering one, and now they're in this um, elated or slightly confused, relaxed kind of space. And that's a wonderful time to capture the moment by not saying anything for a little bit and just paying a really close attention to what's going on in their physiology. And then in the right moment, when I'm in feeling a good rapport, to be able to say something that would be a lasting suggestion or something that could get them to anchor it. Then we can call on it later, even if it's later in the session. I can say that word or in that particular way, and then they smile or they have some kind of a moment with that. They get it. They get it in the sense of a meta communication. Like we
Mhm.
did a little bit of a quantum leap or something.
Right.
Kind of
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah. What's your opinion on our Western culture? And I'm overgeneralizing. Our Western culture has been so detached from the power of community in healing, the power of nature in healing. And again, it's overgeneralization. What are your thoughts on that? And how can we, maybe as a culture or even just as individuals, kind of recapture some of that to take these problems from problems to spiritual solutions?
Well, from what I've seen over the last, just tracking over the last 20, 30 years, I feel that we are doing that. I see things like Michael Pollan's release of his book. I think it's How to Change Your Brain or something like that. I can't remember the
Right,
title of his
right.
book. And all of a sudden, um, psychoactive plant medicines become mainstream. Terms like psychonaut, and I think those kinds of things, uh, they place you in a receptive mode where people begin to search back for things that could fit the pattern that they're feeling, and that usually ends up being religious or quasi-religious kinds of things. They
Mhm.
remember being a child at church or receiving a blessing, or saying a prayer with their grandmother, or they have a fantasy about being connected to the ancient times with pagans and solar rituals and things that they've read in mythology or in various books, and there becomes more of a desire in a cultural sense to want to create that or recreate that. So you get Burning Man, you get all of these music festivals, and you get Pagan Pride Day, and it gets bigger and bigger. I think what's been happening is it's happening on the um, sort of the local level. It's also happening in academia a little bit. You're seeing really educated people writing books about this now, about um, you know what is ethical about like a cult, for example. Most people think of a mind control cult. They think of toxic behavior and oppressive behavior. But cult, as you know, is just a neutral term, really. It doesn't have to be an evil cult or a mind control cult. It can just be several people believing the same thing and practicing together. That's a cult. Um, Jamie Wheel wrote with Stephen Kotler the book Stealing the Fire, and it's all about flow and what they've learned from special forces in the military and fMRI scans and breath work and things. And he wrote another book called Recapture the Rapture, which was all about you know, how could we recreate this ethical cult in our society so that people could begin to feel swept up and taken into the numinous, taken into something bigger than what they would normally experience, because each of us, argued by the book and by the many experts in the book that are quoted, that we all crave to have this mystical connection of some kind. We just might have negative opinions about religious experiences we've had, but what's inside of that is this appreciation for magic. We appreciate the things that are mysterious, and we crave to feel connection, and we crave to feel like we belong to something bigger. And that is, in a sense, what rapture is, at least from what I can surmise, that rapture is just really being taken up into something that's much greater than you. So there is a fundamentalist Christian way of interpreting that, and I'm not referring to that, of course, but I think these lines of exploration are happening on many different levels right now in a lot of places in the United States. People are attempting to recapture the rapture.
Right.
So I feel personally that I've been working on that myself, just with my group of friends. When we have a sacred ritual, we do this with an open-ended, it's non-dogmatic, just very open-ended, but powerful. And that's what I think. And I'm sticking to it. Yeah, that's what I think.
And when you were saying that, it's like, I think we as a species crave the feeling of significance, which is that community that, hey, you matter. And I think maybe for so many years, we haven't felt like as individuals, we matter because we haven't felt as connected, to something greater, whatever that could be. And that's why I think a lot of what I see in my therapy work is a lot of people who are doing sometimes, we'll just call it bad things, regardless of what it really is. But those bad things, but the root thing is they want to feel significant. They want to feel that what we're talking about. But it's like in the confines of what they know, or the patterns they've developed, they're seeking the Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame, and doing sometimes the really negative things to their health and all of these things and reputations or whatever. And I'm just wondering, it's like that desire to feel significant, whether it's a spiritual significance or just even a significance in general in your life. If that's not maybe some of the cures for a lot of our existential angst, if you will. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it makes me ask the question, how's that even possible? If I were to feel like that were so important to me that I'm gonna seek it through, I don't know, murder or something violent to another person, how that would somehow make me feel powerful, to be respected and feared or something like that. For that to even be possible, I must feel a deep and strong need for what you're talking about, and it has to feel a little bit like there's this gaping hole where it should be. And that sounds a lot like trauma to me. That sounds a lot like disconnection from family system, but in a really unhealthy way. One of the reasons why I'm so attracted to the systemic work is because of that. It's giving me a perspective to put all of the other NLP stuff that I've learned along the way. And I see that many of us grew up with a parent or parents who were terrible in some respects. So how do they go from having that experience of trauma to, I want to look at them as a vessel of unconditional love and acceptance? How can I even, that's a quantum leap. So if they don't know how, and they don't do the work to work through that and create that kind of personal connection, as we connect beyond the egos of our parents, but into the station in life that they held for us as
Hmm.
givers of life,
Right.
gateways for us. To be able to do that work means you probably have to be, well, number one, exposed to the kind of person who can help you do it, but also be really, really willing to go there. The very next best thing is to, I think for the nervous system seeking to feel that, is to just think, how can I feel this? And it's going to be drugs, it's going to be violence, it's going to be, sex, or maybe endangering yourself by being an adrenaline junkie, dopamine junkie, and a variety of things like that. And so I think you could just either pivot either way, but most people don't have the resources available to them to do it the way that might be healthy. And so they
Hmm.
find what's easier, which is unhealthy ways.
Hmm.
My thoughts on it.
Yeah, and it's going back to my earlier comment about our culture has not really provided us with the pathways that in other
Yeah.
cultures may be more automatic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I mean, war is not something that's just a Western industrialized experience. And you hear more tribal indigenous cultures, they had certain things they did after the war or leading up to the war. And their ability to come back and to flow in and out if you're a warrior without losing what unfortunately so many of our young men and women are dealing with, losing a part of themselves emotionally, mentally. And so it's just been kind of um, we're going to, it's kind of like left brain, right brain. We're going to take a left brain and we're going to be real logical, and emotions have no place in this. So it's ignoring the other part. And I'm talking about culturally. I mean, Ian McGilchrist in the Master and His Emissary, that book where he talks about how we become a left brain culture without much paying attention to our intuition and all. And I'm seeing that kind of from what you were saying, is that we don't have that pathway as a whole culture. Fortunately, as we're talking, there are some avenues, but I'm just thinking about, some farm boy or girl in small town Iowa who may not have access to internet. I mean, you kind of on your own a lot of times, and
It's
that's too
true.
bad.
And we used to have it. I mean, if you go back far enough, we had that.
Mhm.
I mean, we've all heard, well, those of us who are interested in Hellenistic stuff, and we've heard of the Eleusinian mysteries, right?
Mysteries, yeah, yeah.
And that was very much a sacred medicine journey, as they've discovered. But that kind of sacred drama where, the mystery theaters that were meant to convey a bigger picture. It wasn't mystery like whodunit for some people who haven't heard that term before,
Right.
but the mystery in the sense of they're giving you an experience of something that goes beyond, to access the mysties, and I love that was part of our embodied culture at one time, and sadly, there's always the possibility when there's a strong religious element that is monotheistic, that it has its benefits because it's one and it's solid and it's strong, but the disadvantage is that it can sometimes break apart and divorce people from resources that were already working very well. And so then you have broken traditions. You don't have a continuing line of people to do these kinds of things. You have the druids that die, that get killed off, and you have the witchcraft, the wise women and men who were trained, all of them burnt at the stake, and nothing written, so you can't really access it. Or if it were written, it was destroyed and burned. So I just think you're right. Like I know we need it, and I see people displaying the need. They display that they're lacking it, and I also see people working really hard, probably us included in that, to try to create it again, or to open the door and have the light come in, because we need it as a culture. We're suffering. There's no question. Not that suffering was ever not a thing for the human race, but we are really suffering right now. There's a lot of problems going on. We need light. We need healing, big time.
Yeah. Now, in the family constellation work that you're doing, in a way, it's carrying on the tradition of the mysteries, the performance. Because, and if
Yeah.
people don't know what we're talking about, family constellation work, people like Bart Hellinger, um, even Alejandro Jodorowsky's work involving family, where people pick different members of their family out of audience members, and it's this sometimes unspoken physical performance they do that unconsciously, in some cases, kind of unwinds and rearranges things. And that to me is that's filling that void for some, not everyone. It's an acquired taste for some, but that of those Western mystery schools, if you will, the true ones. And so, yeah, I agree. I think it's out there. It's just, it's still kind of, I mean, for most culture, it's still kind of fringe,
Mhm.
which I'm,
Yeah.
I don't understand. It's like we have this weird, and this is just Paul's commentary, so just ignore it. This weird, hey, I'll turn on the Travel Channel and watch 3 hours of ghost shows or these kind of things. But God forbid I go to a family constellation workshop and heal
Right.
my family trauma for the past 3 generations, because that's
Yeah.
weird. And I'm kind of like,
Right.
why is this disconnect?
Yeah.
You know?
That blows my mind. Yeah, it blows my mind. Absolutely. But I don't mean to sound elitist by saying it this way, but the kind of primetime television culture that gets generated by people just sort of sitting in front of the TV and watching these literally programming, and it's mind numbing what happens. I love television. I love shows. I like stories. I like movies. I'm not saying that I don't watch them or anything like that, but at some point you have to kind of question: am I just seeing um, the same thing over and over again? And is the dialogue that I'm laughing at, is this really funny? And uh, why am I affected by this? And do I really need to keep repeating this in my mind? Because at some point it becomes me.
Mhm.
It starts to infect or generate its own viral quality inside of me. So we have to pay attention to that if we want to have enough free space and energy to heal and to become who we're intending to become.
Mhm.
It's just a given.
Yeah.
So yeah, if there were more, well, you mentioned Jodorowsky. Let me bring up his Dune
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah.
Okay, because the
Great.
the documentary on the making of that movie is telling, and it's related to what we're talking about, because he really, really, really thought, you saw the making of, right, the
Oh yeah.
documentary?
Oh yeah. It's wonderful.
Mind blowing.
Yes.
But
Yes.
one of the things, if you recall, he spoke about how he didn't want this just to be a movie. This was going to be a movement. He was going to start something that was going to cause a planetary shift. That sounds like megalomania, and it might be, but the intention was really beautiful, because um, every act in it was a magical act for him, I believe.
Mhm.
Like, it was so intentional,
Mhm.
not just based on money. I mean, he threw in $5 million of his own cash
Mhm.
somehow,
Yeah.
and he lost it all because they never
Mhm.
produced the movie. But he had Salvador Dali, and he had Orson Welles, and he had Pink Floyd doing the soundtrack, and he had, what was it, Keith Richards, and
Yeah. He wanted
uh,
that David Carradine was playing the lead, and
right.
yeah.
And Geiger, or
Yeah.
Geiger, however you
Yeah.
pronounce his name,
Yeah.
doing the art. I mean, it was just a very, very powerful set of ideas and people put together.
Mhm.
And he wanted to make this change. And everywhere he took it, he had the whole thing storyboarded out. Everywhere he took it, every movie house said, the American people are not ready for this.
Right.
It'll go over their
Yeah.
heads. They're
Yeah.
not ready. We
Mhm.
won't fund it. We won't allow it. Damn it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You ruined it, ruined by these corporate interests and narrow-minded. Like, what was it that threatened them so much?
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah. It's like Richard Starkey, the director, was in that movie commenting, and he says it all came down to they were terrified of his creativity. And I thought,
Yeah.
what a line, and what a weird way to see the world. I'm terrified of someone else's creativity. I'm not terrified of bad acting or bad directing. I'm
Right.
not terrified of bad storyline. I'm terrified of his
Right.
creativity. I mean,
I'm not terrified of the degradation of the American mind.
Right. Yeah.
That doesn't scare me at all. But his creativity, oh yeah, really scary.
Yeah.
Jeez.
I know.
But but don't you um, also have the experience sometimes that there are people who are afraid of your own vulnerability?
Oh,
Like when
yeah.
you really let yourself be you, there are some people who get very unnerved by that.
Hmm.
People who outwardly appear to be very strong and dominant, especially in cases like that. It can be really, really, it's almost like you're unveiling the holy of holies to the uninitiated or something like that, and it just freaks them out.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's funny you said this. This just came to my mind. I remember years ago I met a guy who was a Swami, an Indian Swami,
Uh-huh.
and he was a friend of a friend, and they were talking to him, asking the previous day he had gone out with this woman and her husband named Richard, and they were trying, I guess, trying to keep him occupied. And he's kind of sitting there, and they go, "Well, you can go hang out with Richard. You really like Richard?" He goes, "I didn't really like Richard," and they're like, "What?" I mean, he was okay. I didn't really like him because he was living his life just being so authentic that we're supposed to be, oh yeah, well, maybe not. He just thought he was just, no, well, I really didn't like Richard. I, had a problem with him. I did. It was just, what was it? It was funny to me. It wasn't him. It was watching how do we deal with someone, being that honest. He wasn't being rude or ugly. He was just that, I didn't really like
Yep.
Richard, you know?
Well, the the feeling that you just mentioned, that people feel, like maybe call it the awkwardness or whatever in the
Yeah.
air,
Yeah.
at handling something that's very pure and honest. We talk about that in systemic work,
Mhm.
as related to the family system and the loyalties. Like we're supposed to feel certain things, that
Mhm.
these are things that prevent you from being shunned in an evolutionary sense. So the evolutionary force can come in to change things, but there's also the biological imperative to comply and to not rock the boat, and to avoid
Mhm.
shunning at all costs, because your family line will just be abolished if you're shunned. And I think we have that very strongly reinforced in most of us, that we have to feel awkward and uncomfortable with things if they're not going along and towing the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's tough, we're helping people to handle, this is holiday season. We're having this conversation, and it's just after Thanksgiving, and we're getting ready to have Christmas and Hanukkah and all that stuff. So this means people getting together. And I can just authentically say that holidays have been a source of difficulty for me for many years, pain and challenge and things like that. But I get a lot of people in my office that have the same issues coming up, or similar issues. It's so common now. You can just talk about that in an open way, and people go, "Oh yeah, 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 I know how that feels," and it's really common. But yet we still are going. We feel obligated to go. We still have to show up. Oh my God, I gotta make my pie or whatever it is, and I gotta bring it. I gotta listen to Aunt so and so, and and oh my gosh, what's my mom gonna say to me when all these things are gonna come in. Oh, my brother, so I don't know, but I see that as a gold mine, or potential gold mine, if we can sift through the negativity and all the toxic stuff, as far as finding your authentic self. And where do you exist in all of this, within it? Like, you're going into the situation every time, and if you don't change anything, it's going to be the same. But what is it inside that would need to change, like to be able to go into something like that and be comfortable with it, or to be comfortable not going at all? That's a lot of work in there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I'm
And
remembering Ram Dass told someone one time, he said, if you really think you're truly enlightened after spending 10 years
yes.
in India, go back and spend time with your family.
Yeah. Totally.
Uh, but
Yeah. That's a great line. Love that one.
uh, yeah. Well, let me ask you this: since we're spending a lot of time talking about problems and spiritual solutions and constellations,
Mhm.
um, and we briefly mentioned creativity. So to me, I don't know if people can heal without some aspect of creativity, because that means creativity is also doing something you haven't done before,
Yeah.
doing it in a totally different way. How
Yeah.
do you, when you're working with people, how do you either bring it forth yourself or giving them permission to be more creative?
So it helps if someone can relate to the metaphor of a magician.
Mhm.
They don't have to, but in at least, say 65 to 70% of the people, they can relate to it if I talk about being a wizard, or, because I can build the metaphor and I can work that metaphor. And one of the things that magicians sometimes say is abracadabra. And there are quite a few people who are using this metaphor these days, but in Aramaic, it's an actual word. In Aramaic, it means I create as I speak, or I speak it forth into creation. Same thing. And I talk about that and how we are bringing ourselves into every situation anyway. And I try to have them search out times when they felt one way about something and then they didn't feel that way later.
Right.
It could be simple, something from their past, and I get them to at least start to see that it's happened before, and to know that the structure of it was that they had to start thinking new things. And in order to think new things, they had to start questioning things. They had to start asking themselves, why is this not working? And
Mhm.
how is it being a problem? What's it preventing me from doing? What's it causing me to do that I don't want to do? All that stuff.
Right.
And as we start doing that, I said, you see how you're exploring the problem, you're thinking about it differently. And isn't this similar to what writers do when they're writing stories, when you're writing, or if you're designing a movie, or even a comic book, a series of images? How would you do that? You have to first um, you know have a problem show up. You have to think about what that problem is. You got to envision yourself as what's a possible solution. Is that solution something that you would actually want? If so, great. If not, what's another solution? And I just start to keep pointing that out, that do you understand that this is your mind creating right now?
Mhm.
And then get a little closer, get into the somatic part of it. Do you feel like this is just in your head? Or can you feel these ideas as feelings that are dear to your heart? Or do you feel a strong impulse inside your gut that you've got to do this, or a block, like a fear coming up? Either one. See, these are all somatic responses. And then I'll, to get into a real creative mode, I'll suggest to them that this is about more than just words. This is about what the words represent and the energy that motivates you to even say them in the first place. We can change that. Ideas are malleable if you just understand that the idea is malleable. It's just a belief. So creativity, if I notice that they're not doing anything different in their life, of course I'll suggest to them to do something new. What are the things that you used to do? Did you used to go riding on the weekends? Did you draw? Did you journal? What did you do that you're not doing now?
Right.
To invite that creativity in. And then in the session itself, getting them to somatically, mentally, verbally, emotionally invest in front of me as best they can in the creation. And if
Mhm.
there's something they can do at home to reinforce it, whether it's listing it out as a set of goals, or speaking to themselves in the mirror, or doing it as they're on the treadmill, and concentrating on whatever I need to do to get them to start being more of a participant, a director of the movie, rather than just a passive writer or something. And that's how I get them to approach bringing creativity into their problem solving mode.
Mhm. Yeah, because as you were saying that, I was thinking about the whole idea of a magician and wizard, and they create spells.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what it's like when we feel we're stuck. It's like a spell's been put on us, usually by ourselves, but
Yeah.
because we have this spell of limitation, or the spell of restraint, or whatever the spell is. And using that metaphor as the magician, well, the magician then would create a new spell. So, for example, just like saying the affirmations, but you do it at a certain time in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Not only are you doing these things that may make you feel a little better, but you're interrupting the patterns of the previous spell. Because if you think you're no good and life's never going to be different, but for 30 days you say these things and do these things, and that you cannot help but to just kind of break up some of those patterning that's been there.
Yeah, and I think those of us who've looked at witchcraft, magic, and things like that, we know that there are these formula for change that exist in the magical world,
Mhm.
and there are the formulas for change that we learn about in say in an NLP training or something like that. Where I like to focus these days is to keep asking myself what's behind it. Like,
Mhm.
what are the key elements here, the cogs and wheels that are making this work, and how can I make this feel very alive and personal rather than um, say overly formulaic? Because formulas are great, they're really really useful. You probably wouldn't be here where I am right now if I hadn't had them. But I'm just noticing that for some people they can start to become lifeless if they don't find a way to make it personal.
Mhm.
And I think that those of us that I draw inspiration from, people like yourself, James, our buddy James Tripp, and a lot of these folks that really kind of make our circuits light up when we hear them. It's because they're thinking about that, how to make this alive, how to keep it feeling real. And yes, so I when I talk about affirmations, I get a lot into that. When people ask me about that, I'll let them know that, just saying something that's a quantum leap 1,000 times or more isn't going to get you there. To ask yourself, what could you really believe right now that would get you moving in that direction? And you start with that to get a sense that you're actually creating. When you feel that you're creating, you're starting to step into, or you are in a resourceful state. And you can do so much more from a resourceful state than from an unresourceful state. So anything that's focused on can, like what we can do,
Mhm.
gets the ball rolling. And then if we can capture that momentum, so to speak, it makes it easier to bust through the things that we might have struggled with in the past.
Mhm.
Some things
Mhm.
do take momentum, at least a lot of uh, neurons firing in the same way. We don't have an easy time changing the things that we've believed or become convinced are solid and immovable until we start to figure out how we were creating that. And it takes time.
It
But those
also takes
rituals,
that desire to say, I am at cause, or at least
yeah,
partially at cause.
yeah,
And I don't think we're trained by our culture generally to do that.
no way.
Usually, usually at effect instead of I'm at cause. And and life happens. I mean, it's just the way it is. But okay, it's happened. I'm at cause, and that's a hard lesson, isn't it?
It is. And there are a lot of these paradoxes that I find really intriguing. They remind me a little bit of a Zen koan, you
Mhm.
know, saying, you know, there's a lot in this world that you were born into that was just, you had no influence over whatsoever. So it's not your fault. But you are responsible. And what if you took responsibility for your life and everything that's happening in it right now?
Mhm.
What would you do differently? And what could you create from that space? It's very different because it's paradoxical to say that, because it's like, well, wait a minute, didn't you just say it wasn't my fault? Well, yeah, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. That's the thing. And for some people, really acknowledging that first, hey, you know what, it wasn't your fault that this happened to you, not at all. That's a good starting point for them to feel that, in a sense, they're getting an energetic hug, that it's mama, it's
Mhm.
nurturing to
Right.
to be able to kiss the boo-boo, in a way.
Mhm.
But then, okay, now we're ready to make a change, because that's a different phase, the phase of needing to feel that you're receiving compassion versus the place where, okay, I'm ready for things to be different now. I'm going to grab myself up from my bootstraps and start making changes.
Mhm. Yeah.
Different space. Some people skip one or the other.
Yeah. Well, Carlos, this has been a fantastic interaction as usual with you.
Yeah.
I think if people may need to go back and watch this like a couple of times, because I think you've left some nuggets there that I think it's important that we can all pay attention to. If somebody's interested in maybe working with you in a coaching or a hypnotherapy or whatever, what's the best way for people to find you these days?
Actually, my telephone number is listed on my website, so hypnotherapiebreakthrough.com.
Okay.
I do work with people from around the world, so that number will just be a +1 if you're coming from out of the country. And what I would recommend is the first step is just send me a text message or give me a call. I will call you back, and I always offer like a 20 to 30-minute initial phone consultation anyway, because it's important that there's a good match. So we'll talk about it. We'll talk about what you want to achieve. And if I'm the right person for you, then by the end of that call, we'll just book your first session. And that's how it goes. And we'll talk about structure and what you want to achieve and all that. And it's pretty simple. And I'll get back to everybody who sends me a message on that.
Okay, excellent. Well, I really appreciate you chatting with me today. I think,
Honored to be here.
yeah, I appreciate that. We went over a lot of stuff, and as I always ask, the people who are such great guests, let's maybe down the road, let's do a part 2 if you're up for it.
I'd love that. That'd be really
Awesome.
fun.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
my
for
friend.
letting me on the show. I really, really enjoyed it.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah.